The purpose and intention of the 2 days was to really celebrate, as Rick and Diana, you know, the 20th anniversary of Parker Palmer's landmark text, The Courage to Teach, and how usually we think of textbooks as being, they're in the 20-year-old range as being classics,
right.
you know, and have certain wisdom, but not necessarily contemporary wisdom, and as evidenced by the last 2 days, certainly
Right.
that has been the case. But part of this celebration of this 20th anniversary was to bring the two of you out to work with Kate Willink and myself on creating 2 days of interactions, live encounters, openings, redefinitions of what we do, and so it's been a great pleasure to have the two of you with me. And you know, Rick, you and I have, as I've mentioned before, have traveled probably 12 years now together.
That's right.
The first time I was out at the Fetzer Institute and starting facilitator preparation and connecting with you, and you've been a long-term mentor for me around this courage work, which is something we'll talk a little bit more here about. What is that thing, and what role can it play in contemporary forms of education, whether it's higher ed or early childhood or K-12. But Rick's, in addition to being a good mentor and friend of mine, he was the co-creator of the Center for Courage in Renewal, which is as we like to say, is the organization that put the wheels on Parker's ideas, along with your spouse and partner and collaborator, Marcy Jackson. So it's a great pleasure to have you here as a friend and as an institutional embodiment of a great thing. And then I have Diana Chapman Walsh here now, who's, as I have said recently, is my new old friend.
I love
right?
that.
My
Yeah,
new old
I
friend.
wish I'd heard that before I described Kate's book, because I would have said
Sure,
that.
would have stole that. Yeah, and I say that in the sense of as we know in the courage work, that sense of deep speaking to deep. And it doesn't take much to realize that the deepness of my heart and my soul is connecting up in appreciation with the depth of your own heart and soul. And so, although we've just met, it's great to connect with you on that level as well. And and so that's happening at the same time. You bring so much institutional wisdom to this place and time. Being a faculty member at Harvard, a faculty member at Boston University, of course the president of Wellesley College for 14 years, where you were well known for that leadership style of reflection and resiliency. And I don't think any of your biology uses this word, but I think that sense of vulnerability with strength, I think is a phrase you used this morning. So it's a great pleasure to have you here as well, and helping Kate and I bring these 2 days to fruition, as well as Kate and I already have plans for the two of you going forward, right? So be warned. You may not want to answer your emails if you see my name or Kate's on it.
I'll always answer your emails.
But I wanted to take at least not miss the opportunity to engage you one more time, perhaps maybe more in a coming to an end, or at least an end relative to these 2 days. And maybe that's the best way to think about it. Is it's what's a little bit more wisdom you can offer Kate and I and the wider educational community that can help move us, invite us, maybe not move us is the right word, but invite us really into some sort of next places of understanding this thing called education and our own personal roles in it. And so I'd like to start really with where we started last night with the panel. And the question for the panel, which I would love to hear the two of you talk about, is how did each of you become involved in courage work? And how has that involvement continued to foster growth and thriving for you? So it's a two-part question. How did you get involved, and how does it continue to all these years later, as if that's a burden, but all these years later, Rick, for you, starting with Parker in his kitchen, with you and Marcy figuring out how to put wheels on this man's ideas, and still you're here and still alive and vibrant, and Diana, for you as well. But so.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the question, and again, thanks for these days of just a lot of hospitality, a lot of heartfelt work. The image that came to me while you were just speaking, Paul, especially here we are in Colorado in the Front Range, was that we've been on a hike together and we've reached a saddle. And there's higher elevations that we may still go, that you may still go, but you're inviting us to say, this is enough for now. Let's camp out here, let's pause, let's get the fire going, and let's talk a little bit about what we've been learning.
Right.
And I've seen you do that in your teaching and inviting a lot of effort, and now let's pull back. I got to meet Parker fairly early in my career, shortly after finishing my own graduate work in theology and ethics. He did a lot of work supported by the Danforth Foundation with campus ministers. And like so many people, I met him through a piece of his writing.
Mm-hmm.
I still remember that title of that book chapter. It was called Campus Ministry, A Political and Pastoral Vocation, Holding Paradox.
Right.
And of course, like a red thread through everything he's written, paradox runs true. And I read it and I had the thought, I need to meet this person. So I called him up, and a year later he agreed to keynote a national conference of student YMCA leaders, student leaders, and staff. And we started a friendship. And then it continued years later when Diana and I had the privilege of being in the same cohort of the Kellogg Fellowship Program, a mid-career leadership program. And we had 2 one-week retreats on the theme of leadership, spirituality, and community. How is it that we weave those 3 strands together for the long haul? And then a few years later, when he was in early conversations with the Fetzer Institute about imagining a more robust form of support for public school teachers, he engaged us. And we went for a walk on the Wellesley campus at the time of your formal installation. Mm-hmm. And at one point, he kind of took me aside and he said, I want to tell you a little bit more about this work I'm doing at Fetzer. So he was planting the seeds.
I love that
So
it was planted at
it was
Wellesley.
on the campus,
I love
right
that.
outside the chapel.
I didn't know
Went
that.
for a walk.
Beautiful.
And that was kind of what, and he wasn't clear about how that might work out. Matter of fact, shortly before Fetzer offered us the support to do those jobs, he actually tried talking us out of doing it, out of his fear of the shadow of that institution that might hurt his dear friends. But we said, no, we think we can handle that shadow if we do it together. And so that was mid-90s, and then we have been doing the kind of organizational wheel balancing ever since.
Yeah.
Although we've handed that executive leadership off to others now, but we still stay involved and love to be involved with things like you and Kate are doing here with other good people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so what continues to keep you alive and engaged in the courage work?
Yeah. I think, Parker talks about it, and he embodies so beautifully a person with a teacher's heart. And I think he looks for, and I think I have come to realize that I really look for, what is that motivating force?
Right.
And how does it not only stimulate a person's journey, but also create points of connection and opportunity, just as you were working with your alumni, for being in congruence with other people who are also seeking to do similar good work and are maybe on this earth for similar reasons. Mm-hmm. So I think I've come to find that much of my vocation is about, this curiosity I have, this love I have of learning more about why do people do what they do. Mm. And then when I hear a little bit about what you like to do and what Kate likes to do, I sometimes will say, well, have you 2 met each other? You're on the same campus. Right. That connecting of good people and good ideas. And I used to think that, well, everybody does that, but I guess I've come to realize that's one of the things that I bring to the party.
Right.
And I think Parker's a great connector. He talked last night about one of the parts of the job description that's not often listed on any profession is that of community organizer. How is it through being a physician, through being a pastor, through being a professor, I'm also seeking to organize the kind of community I most would want to be a part of. Right. And which I think that's the one. And so I think I've been a bit of a lifelong community organizer too, and I've found a good partner in Parker.
Yeah, and speaking of good partners, I know you and Diana have I've shared this journey for a while. So Diana, how about yourself? When do you?
I had never heard of Parker Palmer until I met Rick. I hadn't read anything of Parker's or known anything of his work. We were in this Kellogg Fellowship together. I think I mentioned this at one of our circles. And I was an academic, trying to make myself into an academic, and I was sort of a round peg trying to fit myself into a square hole. I felt that in some ways, but I was committed to doing it, and so I was very much in my head. I was very much about tracking things intellectually, and my husband's a famous biomedical researcher, a deep scientist. Doesn't have any the sort of sense of a spiritual life, except that his science is a kind of spirituality in a way. But those we didn't use those words, and we didn't think in those terms, and so we're in this kind of world of the elite Eastern Academy that doesn't use words like spirituality.
Right.
And I arrive, and that's who I am. And Parker said he looked at me sort of suspiciously at first, sort of thought, who is this uptight woman from Boston? So I arrive at this meeting, and but I was an English major at Wellesley, and I love words, and I love poetry, and my family was Quaker, and Parker was Quaker. So there were things that were resonating between us. In any case, Rick had hosted a first retreat with Parker for a week for this group of Kellogg Fellows, and I kept hearing about it. I didn't go to it because it didn't sound heady enough for me, but the way people talked about it, I realized I just had to come to the next one, and I did, and it was on community. And I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Parker was just beginning to create this forum that became Courage Work. He was testing it out with us, and maybe not only with us, but he became quite important to our little group of Kellogg Fellows. We were just one cohort of many. We were group 8.
And we to him.
We just latched onto this guy. So he did the 2 small groups, and he also did our last total group retreat, and talked about letting go, and it was very meaningful to everyone. So Parker became, he wasn't officially anything to this fellowship or to the group. But
let me tell one story that I'm privileged to know, and I'll tell it as briefly as I can. Good. The second retreat we did with Parker came out right after his book, The Active Life, came out.
Right.
We bought copies of that. We invited everybody to read it. We got there, and then the first thing he said, as some author, he said, if any of you have authored books, you know that by the time you get the book published, you can't stand to be in the same room with it. You just want to. So he just rather abruptly said, so set your book aside, and we're going to work with poetry this week. Oh, and by the way, though I brought a few, we're going to write some poetry. We're going to just allow our own poets to speak to us this week. And this heady colleague of mine used her head and her heart to...
The poetry just took me over.
Wow.
It came to me. I didn't come to it. It was, and I was just now, as you were talking about Parker, so there was one, the last one was about goodbye to Parker, and the first 4 lines were...
The poem was Goodbye to Parker?
Yeah.
No, it was at this retreat. Parker Palmer fished with us a Rio Grande of feeling. We reeled some in, but truthfully, Parker's left us reeling. It went on in that vein for
that's great.
4 or 5 stanzas. Anyway, it was just one after another. It was hilarious. It was really amazing. And so something opened, really cracked open for me in that week with Rick and Parker, and it changed the direction of my life in a really meaningful way. So it was. Then I began reading his work,
and then so what's kept you in that stream, to use that image?
And so then he spoke at the multi-faith baccalaureate service the evening of my inauguration into the presidency. And read this Mary Oliver poem and said the world needs presidents who are also poets. Keep your poetry alive. And we remained friends. And my presidency was very much influenced by that opening that had happened with him. and I found other people too. So there were, there were management consultants and coaches and people like that, and one in particular who was very important and very valuable. And so that work, the inner work with Parker and with this other person, it sort of blended together. And then after I left Wellesley, I joined nonprofit boards of organizations that I really admired, whose mission I admired, but also that were led very effectively. Did that, and sort of still kind of applying what I had learned about leadership that I sort of evolved and learned at Wellesley, bringing it to other settings. So following that thread through, and one of the boards brought me into close connection with the Dalai Lama, so there's some Buddhism, so
Right.
all these threads and pieces, but the kind of continued exploration of the inner life and how it comes out, and walking the Mobius strip has just been who I've been. And sometimes I'm doing that in settings where it's really unexpected and odd. For 10 years I was on the director of the State Street Corporation, which is this big Boston bank that managed trillions of dollars in assets and every night reconciled the world's markets. And here I am sitting in this boardroom with these people who are all just, bankers and business people. And they sometimes would say to me, you don't say that much, which was good because I didn't really understand what they were doing. But when you do, we sit up and take notice. So there was something I was bringing there too without even being aware of it. So
Great,
it's always been there.
Yeah, just to piggyback a little bit, Diana, what you're saying is, when I was going to say jumped into the river of courage, I'm not sure that jumping is the right word, but when I found myself in the middle of that river, sort of feel like I had two choices, and I'm glad I took the second one, which was just to be intentionally swept along.
Mm-hmm.
To wherever that current may take me. And certainly it's held true for me in my context within education. And I wanted to ask you both about that particular piece as it relates to, so much nowadays in education is standards, accountability, efficiencies, testing, all of this emphasis on structure and form. And yet the Center for Courage and Renewal and Courage Work in general is operating from an entirely different frame of understanding from inner renewal and the rewards that come with that. And so the question, and either of you can answer this together or separately, is so why is the emphasis in the Courage community so uniquely important, especially today, given the dominant context within education writ large?
Well, I have a couple thoughts, and I know Diana, who spent her career as a teacher and educational leader, but I think, seeking to be somewhat brief, those of us in the Courage community, and certainly Parker, believe there's a higher accountability than all of the ones that you just listed. And that is to remain faithful to our calling to those students, to advancing knowledge, etc. And that if we are professionals and if we take our roles seriously, we have accountabilities. We hold them dearly. I have met very few teachers who didn't have, or people in other professions who didn't have a pretty strong sense of their own responsibility to their vocational call. I think part of the problem has been this imposition of external forms of accountability and numerical things. That's, I think, a bit of a disease in our culture, where we think if we put a number on something, that makes it more real. Right. And I'm not against statistics and numerical metrics. That's a part of it. If my iPhone battery says it's down to 3%, I probably better find a plug. So it's not an either or, but the focus, the obsessive focus on those external measures and predetermined measurable outcomes, which oftentimes to me can kind of preempt so much of the humanity and creativity, co-creativity, that can lead to our truly extraordinary outcomes rather than just hit the bar. And as Parker has written too, sometimes when there's too much pressure on those measurable outcomes, well, what do people do in institutions? They lower the bar to make sure you hit the measure. Well, that doesn't lead to our very best efforts.
Right.
To say nothing of what happens to the heart of the teachers or the physicians or the clergy persons who are operating in those conditioned relationships. And so I think at times on the way to our very best work, life can be messier and sometimes more fraught with discomfort, but that's part of the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to get everything all neat and tidy and standardized and all of that, my concern and my observation is that sometimes the most creative, the very best folks we want to be in our professions are the ones that say, I can't do it in this environment. There's not enough sense of shared purpose and mission and collegiality. And frankly, Parker will talk about that being some of the reason why he left the academy early on in his life, this lack of enough sense of community.
Mm-hmm.
So he went on, of course, to become a public intellectual and has influenced the academy not a little,
Not a little,
but
right.
from a different place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The secret sauce.
The secret.
The secret sauce that courage is
Well, so
gently inviting everybody to dip into.
So I think we're in a scrape. I just finished reading Steven Pinker's book,
Yeah, you mentioned
right,
that.
Enlightenment, Defending the Enlightenment, and he's very critical of intellectuals for being negative about progress. He makes a very strong case that if you look since the Enlightenment, the progress has been stunning across every sector of society, and that's true. But I led Wellesley through, I started in 1993, I finished in 2007. So we moved through the turn of the millennium, then the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the eventual wars that followed, and the sense that everything was speeding up and that the confidence in social institutions was breaking down, and this realization that the combination of technology, spinning and spinning these whole new ways of being and together, and globalization that was turning us into this one world where we had to figure out how to accommodate each other, is making a demand on the human species that we may or may not be able to meet. Peter Senge said that we are tribal creatures, human,
Yes.
Homo sapiens sapiens. We organize ourselves in tribes. We really haven't figured out a different way to be with each other.
Yeah.
And we need to figure it out because we now have a global emergency.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter says, this is the most profound learning challenge the human species has ever faced.
Mm-hmm.
And we're facing it right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how many years we have, certainly on climate change. Some people believe it's a couple of decades, and who knows. Pinker wouldn't like me to be so pessimistic and negative, and I sure hope I'm wrong. But so there is this huge challenge, and in the meantime, we're learning about complexity. We're learning about neuroscientists are learning about the human brain and the complexity theory, and these different ways of organizing matter, where these connections and networks and are the things that create strength. And so this idea of a hierarchy being an effective, powerful way to create something that will be stable and is being disproved in all kinds of areas of science.
Right.
And lots of people are writing about it and thinking about it in very creative ways. So these are huge challenges that we face.
Mm-hmm.
And a big part of it is how we live together and how we choose to live together. So I think there have been people, certainly since I started reading the literature on higher education reform, and I'm a student. When I start something new, I dig in. So there's very little I haven't read, I think, probably. And people have been writing for years that this is coming, that we need to organize it differently. The competition is not the way to go. We need collaboration. Your colleagues were speaking about that just a few minutes ago, and Rick just spoke about it beautifully, that it isn't serving our needs. It isn't serving the needs of knowledge production. Parker writes about a knowledge that's based in love. But we need to accelerate that process of taking what we see. It's the divided no more thing. There's a reality we see here. We see the reality of climate change, and yet we're choosing not to face those.
Right.
So,
And do you think education is the, if not the, certainly one of the primary social levers for that
well, we
kind
said
of
it's a
change?
learning challenge.
Yeah.
Peter Senge, and I think we'd all agree, it's a learning challenge. We have to learn to be different, this species. We have to learn to interact differently.
Yeah,
And- yeah.
how, it's
So whether
why
it's,
the
yeah.
conversation around education needs to be longer, because then you say, well, what do you mean by education? What do you mean by education?
Right.
Yeah.
We know there are those who
Right.
say the high stakes testing, that's education.
That's education,
Yeah.
right.
And I think what you're inviting us, and maybe the Courage work wants to be part of the conversation about, well, can we pause a minute to say, educare, drawing out
Drawing
the
out.
selfhood of the
Right.
individual, what might that mean?
Right.
And what might it mean to organize ourselves and listen deeply, and maybe occasionally find that the bar gets set even higher.
Right.
Because, and then how do we sustain ourselves
Mhm.
over a career,
Mm-hmm.
the end of which will not have resulted in the resolution once and for all of a problem, but I will have run my length
Right.
of the marathon with a capacity to say, I made my contribution while trying to stay oriented to my sense of what's true north.
Mm-hmm.
And I did it with colleagues and support.
Mhm.
I could not have done it without their help and support.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to somehow give back
Mhm.
to others. I mean, that kind of community, which I think is rich and the kind that we all yearn to be a part of, as opposed to the kind of gears in a big machine.
So Diana, given
Yeah.
what you were saying about learning is where it's all at, and this question came up in the panel last night, is should that book have really been titled Courage to Learn?
I know, that was an interesting question. That was a great
Yeah.
question.
And
Yeah.
what do you think? I mean, not to judge Parker's choice of titles, because that's there's certainly a lot of wisdom in what he did, but does it perhaps suggest that the 20th anniversary should have been Courage to Learn?
Courage to learn, yeah. Well, you don't do it alone. And in some ways, the courage to learn puts the onus on the learner. I mean, I think it's to create communities of learning and
Yeah.
communities of truth-seeking, and right. So it sort of doesn't matter which way it's titled, but it's educating the mind and the heart. Parker likes to speak of the mind descended into the heart.
Right.
And there's a wonderful story that's part of the mind and life lore with the Dalai Lama. So there was a neuroscientist who was going off to, the Dalai Lama had set him up to go in Nepal and work with monks and measure their brain waves and so on. This is the sort of the beginning of these studies of monks and how their brains are so different. And so they were fixing, you've seen the way when you're
plug
doing
in,
these
right,
EKGs
right.
and you have all these odd things all over your head. And so then they brought this person who'd been all wired up, and they brought him out and sat him down. There were some monks all around, and they all started to laugh. They all just laughed and laughed. They were starting to laugh. And so the Western scientists thought they were laughing because it looks funny to have this sort of cap on with all. They were laughing because they were measuring the wrong thing. They should have been measuring the heart. What were they putting all those things on his head for? That's not the seat of knowledge.
Wow.
That's beautiful.
That's yeah.
Great. That's great. Well, with that image, I'll wrap us up with an invitation, since both of you use poetry in your teaching, and Diana, you were talking about finding this inner poet in yourself. Love to hear you just. What's a true north poem or wisdom story for you? We have that book by Teaching with Fire by Intrater and Scribner, where they went out into the world and asked teachers, when you're in your sort of moments of uncertainty, when you're buffeted, pushed around, looking for your rock to stand on, your true north to find your way out of the fog, And of course, all of these great teachers, big and small, submitted pieces as well as explanations as to why. So in that vein, what's your true north poem or wisdom story?
It's a tough one. Yeah, if you're in Courage work for a while, you just like, oh, I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah,
you
right.
closed with today.
Yeah.
But, okay, we'll pause, assuming we want light on the subjects.
It probably didn't.
Just on a timer.
No, it was on a timer or motion.
We're not moving enough.
Yeah,
And
we're in our heads too much.
Yeah, and you've got the eye on the clock as
That's
we need
right.
to.
Yeah, so
So
a few more minutes.
you're throwing me this curveball of this impossible question of
Yeah,
picking
with
one.
Yes.
But I'll pick a poet and then name one of his poems. William Stafford. I live in Seattle. He spent much of his time, although he was born and raised in the Midwest, in the Pacific Northwest, teaching at Lewis and Clark College and establishing the writing center there. Wrote a poem most mornings of his life, and from early in his life, he became fascinated with this question of this image of a thread that he was trying to follow.
Right.
And there's a poem he wrote, it's quite well known, speaks to many people, just weeks before he died, called The Way It Is. The Way It Is. And there's a thread you follow, it goes among things that change, but it doesn't change.
But it doesn't change, yeah.
But somehow you have to persevere, and whether you can see it clearly or difficult things happen, you don't let go of the thread. To me, that is an emblematic poem for myself as well as courage work, or maybe it's what we mean by courage work, is that courage to continue to look for that thread, especially when it's hard. The worldly circumstances make it hard to see.
Yeah.
Because if we can find it, we're bringing something of our true or best selves forward.
It invites me to think differently about that phrase, hanging on by a thread.
Yeah.
Maybe that's one of the best things we could
Thread's the
possibly
thing
do.
that's still
The
left,
thing
just
that's still
keep on
left,
to it.
right? To hang on
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an
Interesting.
affirmation rather than a warning.
Yeah.
For me.
Yeah.
That's a
For me,
great poem.
yeah. Diane, how about yourself?
Well, so I did have a poem in that book. And when you first said that, I said, help, what was the poem I had in that book? And I had a whole description of why it was so important to me. And luckily, it came back.
Came back to you, right? Good.
So,
The
and
poem will be happy for that.
Right, thank goodness. I had one on another one of their poetry books. So I think this is the book in which I had the poem, the Vaclav Havel.
Oh, yes.
And of course, Parker, I think I found my way to it through Parker. He's one of his heroes, another one of his heroes, clearly, who went to the U.S. Congress and said, consciousness precedes being. They didn't know what they were getting there.
Yeah, right.
It went over their heads, but if they had thought about it, they would have been pretty surprised. Anyway, so this one is I can't do it perfectly, but most of it's in my head. So it is I who must begin. Once I start. And then it's not turning to others, not expecting others to, and not blaming others. And he says all of that more poetically. But finding the place of being within myself, then things will follow. And I don't remember that, but the closing is, whether or not all is truly lost depends on whether I am lost. And I just,
That's nice.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that, Paul, would be an example of the higher bar.
Right.
That can't be legislated externally in a meaningful way without tyranny, it seems to me.
Right.
And former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright is having a lot to instruct us on that particular front now.
And wrote the foreword to one of the poetry books.
And she did.
Yeah.
She did.
Yeah.
She did.
But this is then elevating that
yes.
responsibility
To a higher
and privilege
level,
of being a human
Right.
to maybe the level that it should be.
Right. Right.
She is, by the way, a Wellesley alumna and a dear
Well,
friend of
you
mine.
see, there we go. All good things
Seattle.
come from Leslie.
Yeah.
Leslie, right? Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all for your graciousness to spend a little time chatting with me as we're rounding out these last 2 days.
Well, and so we need to thank you, because it's been such a privilege for us to be here, and I've said it over and over in these gatherings, sort of realizing partway into it that our role was to be witnesses of what you were doing, and saying that what we're seeing here is just so inspiring, and that I'm not seeing it in a lot of other places. You're doing something really special, and so we just feel privileged to have been part of this event. And when you send us emails, I promise we'll read them.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
and Kate have a wonderful and powerful leadership partnership going, and many, many colleagues
Yeah.
involved. Happily,
Uh-huh.
we've been observing,
Yeah.
willingly.
Yeah.
Rick, you and I talked about that sense of turning towards one another,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and you have noted so many of those happening over the last 2 days, and certainly
Yeah.
I think that's,
Yeah.
when Kate and I were running up to these last 2 days, we were thanking our lucky stars that we had so many people to turn to
Yes.
in this process, and certainly last night was,
Yeah.
man, if that wasn't a better crystalline example.
That's
of,
right.
in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of change, what do you do?
Show went on.
Show up, you show up with what you've got and you turn to others.
Exactly right.
Beautiful
Yeah.
leadership modeling.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
We can do this. We can do it.
We can do this. We have
Yeah.
all we need. We
Yeah.
can do
Yep,
this.
yep.
We have everything we need. We
Yeah.
can do this.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.